6 weeks after the coalition of righteous species had declared war on humanity. The Grand Assembly Chamber was filled once again with representatives from across the galaxy. But the atmosphere was very different from that dramatic day when High Legislator Renkai had announced his great crusade. The coalition had collapsed. 31 of the original 47 species had formally withdrawn from the war effort, citing everything from economic concerns to philosophical disagreements to simple exhaustion with a conflict that seemed to have no purpose. Only the Thoraxian Dominion and a handful of loyal allies remained committed to the cause, and even they were showing signs of doubt. Renkai stood at the central podium once again, but his forearms hung limply at his sides, and his mandibles clicked with something that sounded very much like defeat. "The humans have made fools of us," he said to the remaining delegates. "They have turned our allies against us through manipulation and deception." Ambassador Tulix floated forward in her aquatic sphere, her tentacles waving gently as she requested permission to speak with respect. "High Legislator, the humans have done nothing except show us who they truly are," she said. "We declared war on them, and they responded by sending food to our hungry worlds and medicine to our sick populations." She gestured toward a display showing news reports from across coalition space. The Verdani crop failures were addressed entirely by human agricultural aid. She continued. The Meladrix plague outbreak was contained using human medical technology provided freely and without conditions. And the Silicate Collective's mining disaster was resolved by human rescue teams who volunteered to help despite the state of war. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. "They have not conquered us with weapons," Tulix said. "They have conquered us with kindness. And I'm not certain that is something we should be angry about." A commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention as a human delegation entered the chamber, led by Ambassador Yoon Daeho in his perfectly pressed suit, followed by Captain Shin Ji and a small group of aides. But they were not alone. Behind the human delegation came representatives from species that had already withdrawn from the coalition, walking alongside the humans as though they were allies rather than enemies and bringing up the rear. His massive reptilian form impossible to miss was Warlord Grinthos of the Corvani. Renkai's mandibles clicked in outrage. "Warlord, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "The Corvani were among our strongest supporters." Grinthos stepped forward and fixed his yellow eyes on the High Legislator. "I came to this war seeking worthy enemies," he rumbled, "and I have found something far more valuable instead." He placed one clawed hand on Ambassador Yoon's shoulder in a gesture of solidarity that shocked everyone in the chamber. "I have found worthy friends." Yoon stepped forward and bowed respectfully to the assembly before speaking. "High Legislator Renkai, I come today not to demand surrender or to negotiate terms of victory," he said, his voice calm and measured as always. "I come to offer something that I hope you will accept." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded newspaper. It was the same newspaper he had been reading on the day the war was declared, preserved carefully over the 6 weeks of conflict. "This newspaper is from the day your coalition announced its intention to destroy humanity," Yoon said. "I would like to show you something." He unfolded the paper and held it up so the assembly could see the back page. The headline read, "Local Dog Wins Regional Competition." Below, it was a photograph of a small, fluffy dog wearing a ribbon and looking extremely pleased with itself. "The dog's name is Chairman Fluffles," Yoon said. "And on the day that 47 species declared war on my people, this was the most important story on the back page of my local newspaper." The chamber was silent, uncertain how to respond to this bizarre display. "When your coalition made its declaration, my people did not panic or despair," Yoon continued. "They continued to live their lives, to raise their children, to celebrate small victories like a dog winning a competition." He smiled warmly, "Because humans have learned through thousands of years of conflict and struggle, that the small joys of life are more important than the grand dramas of politics and war. He folded the newspaper and tucked it back into his jacket. High Legislator, I do not want your defeat or your humiliation, Yoon said. I want your friendship. And I want you to come to dinner at my home so that my wife can serve you her excellent soup, and we can talk about the things that truly matter. Renkai's mandibles clicked in confusion. You want me to have dinner with you? I want us to stop being enemies and start being neighbors. Yoon said, the galaxy is vast enough for all of us, and I believe we have more to gain from cooperation than from conflict. He extended his hand in the human gesture of friendship. What do you say? High Legislator, shall we begin again? The chamber held its breath as Renkai stood frozen at the podium, his entire worldview crumbling around him as he faced a choice that would determine the future of his species. Slowly, hesitantly, he descended from the podium and approached the human ambassador. His forearms remained at his sides, uncertain how to respond to the offered hand. I do not understand you, Renkai said finally. I declared war on your species, and you respond by offering me soup. Yes, Yoon said simply. Why? Because holding grudges is exhausting, Yoon said. And because my wife's soup is genuinely excellent. And because I believe that even enemies can become friends if they are willing to share a meal together. Renkai stood in silence for a long moment. Then, slowly, he extended one of his upper arms and clasped Yoon's hand in the awkward grip of two species learning to understand each other. I would like to try this soup, he said. Chamber erupted in sounds of relief and approval from dozens of species, each expressing their emotions in their own unique way. 6 months later, the war was officially declared, suspended indefinitely. By mutual agreement, Ambassador Tulix had published a best-selling book titled Understanding Humans, a study in controlled chaos that was required reading in diplomatic academies across the galaxy. Warlord Grenthos had established a cultural exchange program between Corvani warriors and human marines. And together, they had invented a new sport that combined elements of both species' martial traditions, and every week, without fail, High Legislator Renkai traveled to the human embassy to play chess with Ambassador Yoon and eat soup made by Mrs. Yoon, who had become something of a celebrity among diplomatic circles for her cooking. One afternoon, a young Thoraxian diplomat approached Ambassador Yoon in the Grand Assembly Chamber, where the human was reading his newspaper, as he always did. Ambassador, I have studied your actions during the war extensively, the young diplomat said, and I must ask how you remained so calm when facing such overwhelming opposition. Yoon set down his newspaper and considered the question with the same thoughtful expression he brought to everything. I read the newspaper to remind myself what matters, he said. I do the crossword to keep my mind sharp, and I remember what my grandfather told me when I was young. What did he tell you? Yoon smiled. He said that the loudest person in the room is usually the most scared, and that true strength is shown not through threats and displays of power, but through the quiet confidence of someone who knows exactly who they are. He picked up his newspaper and showed the young diplomat the front page. The headline read, Chairman Fluffles retires from competition. Legacy celebrated. Below it was a photograph of the same small, fluffy dog, now older, but still looking extremely pleased with itself. Also, Yoon added, I believe very strongly that dogs who win competitions deserve to have their achievements recognized, and that the galaxy would be a better place if everyone took time to appreciate the small victories. The young diplomat nodded slowly, processing this wisdom through the filter of their own cultural understanding. I think I understand. They said, Good, Yoon said, returning to his newspaper. Now if you will excuse me, I need to finish the crossword before my chess match with the High Legislator. He smiled contentedly. The clue for 17 across is the state of peaceful coexistence. And I believe the answer is friendship, and in the Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Council, surrounded by representatives from species that had once declared war on his people, Ambassador Yoon Dae-ho filled in the final word of his crossword puzzle and felt that the galaxy was finally learning to make sense. 3 weeks had passed since the coalition of righteous species had declared war on humanity, and everything was falling apart in ways that High Legislator Ren Kai had never anticipated. The human colonies had not fallen. The human fleets had not appeared in force. Human civilians were going about their daily lives as though nothing of significance was happening, and the coalition was tearing itself apart. From the inside, Ren Kai stood before an emergency assembly of coalition leaders, his forearms spread wide in what he hoped was a commanding gesture. But he could see the doubt in the eyes and sensors and perception organs of his allies. "We must remain united," he declared, his mandibles clicking with desperate emphasis. "The humans are clearly attempting to divide us through psychological manipulation." Ambassador Morith of the Silicate Collective raised one of her crystalline appendages to request speaking rights. "High Legislator, my government has reviewed the tactical situation, and we find no evidence of human aggression against our territories," she said, her voice resonating through her silicon body. "In fact, human traders have continued to visit our border stations as though unaware that a state of war exists. They are trying to lull us into complacency," Ren Kai insisted. "Or perhaps they simply do not consider us a threat," Morith countered, "which is insulting in an entirely different way." The chamber erupted in argumentative sounds from a dozen different species, each expressing frustration and confusion in their own biological manner. Warlord Grento slammed his clawed fist against his speaking platform to demand attention. "The Kovani came here seeking worthy enemies," he rumbled. "We were promised a great war against a dangerous species that needed to be contained. But what we have found is an enemy that refuses to take us seriously." He pointed at Ren Tai. "You told us the humans were arrogant newcomers who threatened galactic stability. But their ambassador reads newspapers during our war councils, and their soldiers laugh while defending against impossible odds." His yellow eyes narrowed. "I begin to wonder if the Thoraxian Dominion brought us here under false pretenses." "The humans are dangerous," Ren Kai protested. "Their military history proves this beyond any doubt." "Their military history proves they are dangerous to those who threaten them," Grentos corrected. "But we attacked them, not the other way around. And now we find ourselves in a war that we cannot seem to actually fight." In the human embassy, Captain Shin Yoonji was reviewing tactical reports with a cup of coffee in her hand and a slight smile on her face. "The coalition's forward fleets have been holding position for 8 days without advancing," she reported to Ambassador Yoon. "Their supply lines are stretched thin, and several species are requesting permission to withdraw for resupply." Yoon nodded thoughtfully while arranging small figurines on a decorative board game set that occupied his desk. "And our fleets. The third response group is maintaining defensive positions around Proxima," Yoonji said. "Earth Command has authorized them to engage only if directly attacked. And they have begun organizing sports tournaments to keep morale high." "Excellent," Yoon said. "What about the humanitarian situation?" Yoonji checked her notes. "The Verdani Collective has experienced crop failures on 3 of their agricultural worlds, unrelated to the war, and their representative has been quietly asking other coalition members for emergency food supplies." And the other members' response: "They are too busy arguing about the war to pay attention." Yoonji said. Yoon moved one of his game pieces and smiled. "Please contact our agricultural ministry and arrange for emergency food shipments to the affected Verdani worlds," he said. "Include a note saying that hunger recognizes no enemies and that humanity hopes for the swift recovery of their crops." Yoonji raised an eyebrow. We are sending aid to species that declared war on us. We are showing the galaxy who humans really are, Yoon corrected. The coalition declared war because they believed we were a threat. So we will prove them wrong by being helpful instead of harmful. He moved another game piece. Also, kindness is much more confusing to our enemies than aggression would be. And confused enemies make mistakes. That evening, Yoon hosted a garden party at the embassy and invited members of the Galactic Press Corps along with any coalition delegates who wished to attend, to everyone's surprise. Nearly half of the coalition delegation sent representatives. Ambassador Tulix arrived first, her aquatic sphere navigating carefully through the garden paths. And she was followed by representatives from the Silicate Collective, the Melodrix Harmony, and several smaller species who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with the war. Even Warlord Grenthos appeared, his massive reptilian form casting shadows across the garden as he surveyed the gathering with predatory interest. Yoon greeted each guest personally, offering food and drink suited to their biology and asking about their families and their homes with what seemed like genuine curiosity. Ambassador Yoon? Grenthos rumbled as he accepted a cup of something called whiskey that the human had recommended. I do not understand you. What confuses you? Warlord, your species is at war with mine, Grenthos said. Yet you invite me to drink with you, and you ask about my grandchildren. Do you have grandchildren? Yoon asked with apparent interest. Grenthos paused, caught off guard by the question. I have 17, he said finally. My eldest daughter has been particularly productive. 17 grandchildren is a blessing. Yoon said warmly. I have only 4. But they bring me great joy whenever I am able to visit Earth. He gestured toward a bench where they could sit together. Warlord, I have studied Corvani culture, and I know that your people value honor above all else, Yoon said. So let me speak to you honestly. As one who respects honor, Grenthos settled his massive frame onto the reinforced bench and waited. Humanity does not want this war, Yoon said. We have never wanted this war, and we have done nothing to provoke it except exist and grow at a pace that makes other species uncomfortable. Then why did you not defend yourselves more aggressively? Grenthos demanded. Your soldiers could have pushed our scouts back at New Melbourne, but instead they held their position and waited, because killing your soldiers would not end the war, Yoon said. It would only create anger and a desire for revenge, and the war would continue until one side was destroyed. He leaned forward. But if we show restraint, if we demonstrate that we are not the monsters the coalition believes us to be, then perhaps some of your colleagues will begin to question why they are fighting. Grenthos was silent for a long moment, processing this information through the filter of Corvani honor codes. You are fighting a war of reputation rather than territory, he said finally. We are fighting a war for friendship, Yoon corrected. Territory can be conquered and lost, but friendship endures across generations. He raised his own glass of whiskey. Warlord Grenthos, I would very much like the Corvani to be friends of humanity, and I believe that you would find us worthy allies in whatever challenges the future may bring. Grenthos stared at the human for a long moment, his yellow eyes unreadable. Then he raised his own glass. You are either the wisest being I have ever met or the most foolish, he said. I have not yet decided which. Perhaps I am both, Yoon said with a smile. Humans have a great capacity for containing contradictions. They drank together under the artificial stars, while around them representatives of species that had declared war on humanity enjoyed human hospitality and began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Captain Yoonji watched from the edge of the garden, her hand resting casually near her sidearm even though she knew it would not be. Needed the ambassador had been right. Kindness was far more confusing than aggression, and confused enemies were already halfway to becoming friends. Warlord Grenthos stood in the command center of his flagship, the Crushing Talon, and studied the tactical displays showing human military deployments with growing unease that he refused to acknowledge. The Corvani had built their civilization on the principles of honorable combat and martial excellence, and Grenthos had personally led campaigns against 17 different species during his long career. But something about the human response to the Coalition's declaration troubled him in ways he could not quite articulate. "Show me the human fleet movements," he commanded. And his tactical officers brought up the relevant data. The humans had deployed exactly 47 ships to defend the Proxima colonies, one for each species in the Coalition. And Grenthos recognized this immediately as a deliberate insult. They were saying that one human ship was worth an entire species. Arrogant. He growled, but even as he said it, he found himself wondering if it was arrogance or simply confidence. He had spent 3 days reviewing the human military history that Ambassador Tulix had shared with the Coalition leadership, and what he found had challenged everything he believed about warfare. The humans did not fight for territory or resources in the way other species did. They fought for abstract concepts that the Corvani barely had words for. Honor was something Grenthos understood, but the humans took it further into concepts like freedom and justice and dignity, and they would die by the millions to protect these invisible things. Most disturbing of all was their capacity for what they called asymmetric warfare. The Corvani believed that battle should be fought between warriors with clear rules and mutual respect. But humans would train their children to carry explosives into enemy camps, and they would poison their own water supplies rather than let enemies drink from them. And they would burn their own cities rather than see them occupied. This was not warfare as Grenthos understood it. This was something far more primal and terrifying. A communication request came through from the Coalition command, and Grenthos activated the display to see High Legislator Vrenkai's insectoid face filling the screen. "Warlord, we have received reports from the Proxima engagement zone," Vrenkai said, his mandibles clicking with what might have been excitement. "A skirmish has occurred between Coalition scouts and human defenders." "What were the results?" Grenthos asked. Vrenkai's mandibles stopped clicking. "The human colony of New Melbourne was defended by approximately 200 soldiers against a scouting force of 4,000 Coalition troops," he said. "The humans held their position for 6 hours until reinforcements arrived." Grenthos processed this information with growing concern. Casualties. Coalition forces suffered 300 dead and 800 wounded. Vrenkai reported. Human casualties were 37 dead and 92 wounded. The numbers were impossible. No species should be able to hold against 20-to-1 odds and inflict such disproportionate losses. "There is something else," Vrenkai added, his voice carrying an edge of confusion. "Our communication interceptors recorded the human defenders throughout the engagement." "What did they say?" "They were laughing, Warlord. And they were making jokes about the situation and placing wagers on which of them would achieve the highest count of enemy disabled." Grenthos ended the communication and stood in silence for a long moment. The humans had faced overwhelming odds and certain death, and they had responded with humor. He thought about his own warriors and how they would react in similar circumstances. And he knew that even the bravest Corvani would show fear when facing such numbers, but the humans had laughed. They had made it into a game. Grenthos called up the research files again and found a section he had previously dismissed as cultural mythology. It described something called gallows humor, which was the human tendency to make jokes about death and suffering as a way of coping with terrible situations. The more dangerous the situation, the funnier the humans found it. This was a species that had evolved to mock death itself in the human embassy. Ambassador Yoon Dae-ho had finished his crossword puzzle and was now composing a formal response to the coalition's war declaration. The response was deliberately brief. The United Earth Government acknowledges the coalition of righteous species declaration of war, he wrote. We note that the declaration was delivered during the lunch hour and request that future communications be scheduled more considerately. He added one more line. We remain open to diplomatic solutions and invite any interested parties to tea at the embassy at their convenience. Captain Yoonji reviewed the message before it was sent and raised an eyebrow. You are inviting our enemies to tea. I am inviting potential friends to tea, Yoon corrected. The fact that they have declared war is a temporary misunderstanding that will resolve itself in time. You seem very confident about that. Yoon leaned back in his chair and considered the question. Captain, do you know why I read newspapers instead of digital news feeds? Eunji shook her head. My grandfather taught me, Yoon said. He survived the Korean reunification crisis when he was young. And he told me that during the darkest days, when everyone believed war was inevitable, he found comfort in the mundane news. He smiled at the memory. He said that while politicians screamed about destruction, the local newspaper still reported on school sports and restaurant openings and community events. And this reminded him that life continued regardless of what powerful people decided. And that is why you read the newspaper during the war declaration. I read the newspaper to remind myself that 47 species declaring war is less important than the Soul Dragon's championship victory. Yoon said, because in 100 years, no one will remember this coalition or their declaration. But the dragon's legacy will live on in the hearts of their fans. He stood and straightened his jacket. Also, I wanted to see how the coalition would react to being treated as less important than sports news. And the answer has been very educational. A notification arrived on his communicator. Ambassador Tulix is requesting permission to visit. Yoonji reported. Yoon smiled. Excellent. Please show her to the garden and have the kitchen prepare those small cakes she enjoyed during the press conference. How do you know she enjoyed them? Because she ate 7 of them when she thought no one was watching, Yoon said. A diplomat notices these things. He gathered his newspaper and his crossword book and headed for the garden. Also, I suspect Ambassador Tulix has realized something important about this situation, and I would very much like to discuss it with her over tea. In the garden, under the artificial sunlight that mimicked Earth's yellow star, Yoon found Tulix waiting in her aquatic sphere. Her tentacles coiled nervously around each other. Ambassador Yoon, she said, her translator rendering her words in clear, measured tones. I have come to ask you a question that I am afraid to hear the answer to. Yoon sat down on the bench across from her and gestured for the attendant to bring tea. Then ask it anyway, he said. Fear of answers has never stopped humans from asking questions. And I suspect it will not stop you either. Tulix's tentacles uncurled slightly. The coalition believes this war will be quick and decisive, she said. They believe superior numbers will overwhelm human resistance within months. Yes, but you are not afraid. Tulix continued. And your government is not afraid. And your people on New Melbourne laughed while facing 20-1 odds. She leaned forward in her sphere. What do humans know that the coalition does not? Yoon poured himself a cup of tea and took a slow sip before answering. We know that this war will not be quick, he said. And we know that it will not be decided by numbers. And we know that we will still be fighting long after the coalition has forgotten why it started. He set down his cup. But most importantly, Ambassador Tulix, we know that we would rather make friends than enemies. And that is why I am having tea with you instead of planning your destruction. Tulix was silent for a long moment. You are offering peace. I am offering tea and cakes and conversation, Yoon said. Peace will come later, when more of your colleagues realize what you have already begun to understand. He smiled warmly. Now, would you like sugar in your tea? And may I recommend the small cakes with the cream filling? News of the human ambassador's reaction spread through the coalition like fire through dry grass. And within 6 hours, every species involved in the declaration had received detailed reports about Yoon Daeho's newspaper and his complete lack of concern. High Legislator Ren Kai paced the length of his private chambers aboard the Thoraxian command vessel, his forearms folded behind his back as he tried to understand what had gone wrong with his carefully orchestrated moment of triumph. The human was supposed to be afraid, he said to his aide, a younger Thoraxian who stood nervously by the door. Their species is barely 200 years into space travel, and they face the combined might of civilizations that have existed for millennia. His aide clicked his mandibles thoughtfully before speaking. Perhaps they do not understand the threat. High Legislator, then we will make them understand, Renkai declared. And he activated the communication array to announce the movement of coalition fleets toward human colonial space across the station. In the human embassy, Captain Shin Yoonji received the notification of fleet movements with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything, and she relayed the information to Earth Command through encrypted channels. The response came back within minutes. Acknowledged. The message read, continue normal operations and ensure Ambassador Yoon has access to fresh newspapers. Yoonji allowed herself a small smile as she forwarded the message to the ambassador, who was currently hosting a delegation of confused journalists from 7 different species in the embassy's reception room. Ambassador Yoon, a Melodrix journalist, chimed, her crystalline body resonating with carefully modulated tones. How do you explain your lack of response to the war declaration? Yoon set down his teacup and considered the question with the same thoughtful expression he might give to a particularly interesting crossword clue. What response would you prefer? He asked. Should I have wept and begged for mercy, or perhaps shouted threats and promised destruction? The journalist's chimes became uncertain. Most species would show some reaction to such a serious threat. And what would that reaction accomplish? Yoon asked. If I showed fear, would the coalition cancel their declaration out of pity? And if I showed anger, would they withdraw their fleets out of intimidation? He picked up his teacup again. Neither response would change anything. So I chose to respond in a way that brought me some small comfort, which was finishing the sports section and learning that the Soul Dragons won their match through excellent teamwork and determination. In her research chamber, Tulix had spent the entire night reviewing human historical records, and what she found had left her unable to sleep despite her species' biological need for regular rest periods. The humans had been fighting wars since before they discovered fire. They had a word for the absence of war, and they called it peace. But their records showed that true peace had been rare throughout their existence, and even during periods of relative calm, they found ways to compete and struggle against each other. Most disturbing of all was their capacity for what they called total war. Tulix read about something called World War II, a conflict that had engulfed their entire planet less than 300 years ago. And the numbers made her tentacles curl in distress. 60 million dead cities reduced to ash, weapons that could poison the land for generations, and when it was over, the humans had rebuilt everything within a single generation, and then proceeded to land on their moon, develop computing technology, and begin reaching for the stars. They treated their most devastating conflict as a learning experience. Tulix composed a message to the coalition leadership, her tentacles trembling as she typed. I have researched human history as suggested by Ambassador Yoon, she wrote. I believe we have made a serious miscalculation, and I request an emergency meeting to share my findings. The meeting was held 6 hours later in a secure conference room. and Tulix presented her research to a group that included Renkai, Grentos, and representatives from the 12 most powerful species in the coalition. Humans have a concept they call the long game. Tulix explained, her voice wavering slightly. They are patient predators who evolved on a world that tried to kill them constantly. And they survived by outlasting every threat they encountered. She displayed images of human history, from ancient battles fought with sharpened metal to modern conflicts involving weapons that could glass entire continents. They do not fight like we do. She continued, when the Thraxian Dominion goes to war, you seek swift victory through superior force, and when the Kovani wage war, they seek honor through glorious combat. She paused, her tentacles writhing nervously. Humans fight to win, and they define winning as the complete elimination of the threat. And they are willing to sacrifice everything to achieve that goal. Warlord Grenthos leaned forward, his yellow eyes gleaming with interest rather than concern. You speak as though this should frighten us, he rumbled. The Corvani have faced worthy enemies before. Have you faced an enemy who will destroy their own cities rather than surrender them? Tulix asked. Have you faced an enemy who will continue fighting for years after any reasonable species would have accepted defeat? She pulled up more records. The humans have a concept called spite, and it means continuing to cause harm to an enemy, even when doing so provides no benefit to oneself. And they consider this a virtue in certain circumstances. The room fell silent as delegates processed this information. Renkai clicked his mandibles dismissively. You have allowed the human ambassador's performance to frighten you, he said. Superior numbers will prevail against any enemy, regardless of their psychological peculiarities. But Tulix noticed that several delegates had begun exchanging worried glances, and she knew that seeds of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, in the embassy garden, Ambassador Yoon sat on a bench beneath an artificial tree, working on a crossword puzzle, while Captain Yoonji stood nearby reviewing security reports. The coalition has moved 3 fleets into position near the Proxima colonies, Yoonji reported. Earth Command has dispatched a 3rd response group. Yoon filled in another word on his puzzle. How many ships in the 3rd response group? 47. Yoon smiled slightly at the number. 1 for each coalition species, he said. Someone at command has a sense of humor. A message arrived on his personal communicator, and he read it with mild interest. The Nervian ambassador has requested a private meeting, he said. It seems she has been researching our history. Should I arrange additional security? Yoonji asked. Yoon shook his head. Bring tea and those small cakes from the reception, he said. Ambassador Tulix seems like someone who appreciates courtesy, and I suspect she has questions that deserve thoughtful answers. He returned to his crossword puzzle. Also, I believe she may be the first member of the coalition to truly understand the situation, and that makes her potentially valuable as a future friend. Yoonji nodded and went to make the arrangements, leaving Yoon alone in the garden with his puzzle and his thoughts. The word he was working on was 12 letters long. The clue was the quality of remaining calm in difficult circumstances. He filled in the answer. Equanimity, it was, he reflected, a very human trait. The Grand Assembly Chamber of the Galactic Council stretched across 3 kilometers of polished obsidian floors and crystalline walls that hummed with ancient energy. And within this magnificent space, representatives from 47 different species had gathered for what they believed would be the most important moment in galactic history. High Legislator Renkai of the Thraxian Dominion stood at the central podium, his insectoid body gleaming under the artificial starlight that filtered through the dome ceiling, and his forearms gestured dramatically as he addressed the assembled delegates with a voice that carried the weight of 3 solar cycles of careful political manipulation. Today marks the end of human arrogance, Renkai declared, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. as he surveyed the chamber filled with his carefully constructed coalition. For too long, these newcomers have spread across our galaxy like a plague, contaminating our cultures with their primitive entertainment. Refusing to share technologies they have no right to hoard, and treating species with millions of years of civilization as their equals. The chamber erupted in sounds of agreement from dozens of different species, each expressing approval in their own unique way. From the harmonious chiming of the Melodrix to the thunderous stomping of the Gravani, Warriors Ambassador Tulix of the Nervian Collective floated in her aquatic sphere near the front of the chamber, her translucent tentacles waving gently as she observed the proceedings with the careful attention her species was known for. And she noticed that the human delegation remained remarkably still. In the section reserved for humanity's representatives sat Ambassador Yun Deho, a 58-year-old man with gray streaks in his black hair and a face that seemed permanently settled into an expression of mild interest. And beside him stood Captain Shin Yunji, commander of the embassy security detail, whose posture suggested she was watching a mildly entertaining performance rather than a declaration of war. Renkai continued his speech for another 20 minutes, listing every grievance the coalition had assembled against humanity, from their rapid expansion into unclaimed systems to their stubborn insistence on treating all species as potential friends, rather than acknowledging the natural hierarchy of civilizations. And therefore, Renkai announced, his voice rising to its dramatic peak as attendants brought forward an ornate document inscribed on ceremonial metal. The Coalition of Righteous Species does hereby declare a state of war against the human species and all territories they claim. The chamber fell silent. Every eye, sensor, and perception organ turned toward the human delegation. This was the moment Renkai had been waiting for. The moment when humanity would finally understand their place in the galaxy. When their ambassador would beg for mercy or rage impotently against the combined might of 47 civilizations. Ambassador Yun Deho did not look up. He was reading a newspaper. Not a datapad or a holographic display, but an actual paper newspaper, printed on processed wood pulp and imported from Earth at considerable expense. And he appeared to be studying the sports section with genuine interest. The silence in the chamber stretched from dramatic to uncomfortable to genuinely confused. Ambassador Yun, Renkai said, his voice carrying a sharp edge of irritation. Did you hear the declaration? Yun glanced up briefly, his expression unchanged, and he nodded once before returning his attention to the newspaper. I heard you, he said, his tone suggesting someone had just informed him about a minor schedule change. Is there anything else? Renkai's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Tulix recognized as extreme agitation, and several delegates began murmuring to each other in confusion. You have nothing to say, Renkai demanded. 47 species have declared war on your people, and you have nothing to say. Yun carefully folded his newspaper and tucked it under his arm before standing, and he adjusted his suit jacket with the casual precision of someone preparing for a routine meeting. High Legislator. I have served as a diplomat for 32 years, Yun said, his voice calm and measured. I have been present for 7 declarations of war, 4 planetary evacuations, and 1 incident involving a misunderstanding about sacred cheese that nearly destroyed an entire trade network. He paused and smiled slightly. This is, if I'm being honest, not even in my top 5 most stressful Tuesdays. The translator systems throughout the chamber struggled with the word Tuesdays and its cultural implications, and several delegates requested clarification from their aides. Captain Shin Yunji stepped forward and handed Yun a small communication device, which he glanced at briefly before returning it. Earth Command acknowledges the declaration and advises us to continue normal operations, Yun announced. I am instructed to inform you that humanity will respond to this declaration through appropriate channels in due time. He sat back down and unfolded his newspaper. "Now, if you will excuse me, I would like to finish reading about the championship match," he said. "The Soul Dragons were down by 3 goals in the second half, and I am very curious to see how they managed to come back." Vrenkai stood frozen at the podium, his carefully planned moment of triumph crumbling around him as the human ambassador showed more interest in a sporting event than in the combined military might of 47 civilizations. Warlord Grenthos of the Corvani pushed through the crowd, his massive reptilian form casting shadows across the delegations around him, and his yellow eyes fixed on the human ambassador with predatory interest. "Is this some human strategy?" Grenthos rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "Do you seek to confuse us with your indifference?" Yoon looked up again, and for the first time, something like genuine warmth entered his expression. "Warlord Grenthos, I have read about your people," he said. "You value strength and honor above all else." "Yes," Grenthos nodded, his clawed hand resting on the ceremonial blade at his hip. "Then you will understand when I tell you that I am not pretending to be calm," Yoon said. "I am calm because I have no reason to be otherwise, and if you wish to know why, I suggest you research human history before your fleets engage ours." He returned to his newspaper. The sports section is particularly educational about how humans handle competition. Tulix observed the human ambassador carefully, her species' natural ability to read biological signals, providing her with information that disturbed her greatly. And she noticed that Yoon's heart rate had not increased by a single beat since the declaration was announced. His body showed no stress indicators whatsoever. He was not performing confidence for political effect. He was genuinely, completely, utterly unbothered by the prospect of galactic war. Tulix quietly excused herself from the chamber and made her way to the nearest research terminal, her tentacles trembling slightly as she began searching through the historical archives for information about humanity. 3 hours later, she was still reading, and her species' equivalent of fear had begun settling into her translucent body like ink spreading through water. The humans had a word for what they did to each other on a regular basis. They called it history, and it was the most terrifying thing Tulix had ever encountered.